everyone loves the distressor. I am also everyone. It's a great rack unit. It does something very special. It adds nice harmonic distortion to vocals, and it helps seat them in a mix. You know, harmonic distortion, it can be good, it can be bad. We're thinking of the good type. Mm-hmm. Even order harmonics, not odd order. And what they do is they make things stand out in a nice way. Let's leave it at that.
Okay.
And when you're using the distressor, what you could do is it helps glue everything together. You know, you could use a decent amount of gain reduction with the distressor, and it also helps with the sibilance, and it makes the vocals it makes them sound great. You know, every vocal is different. You mess with your input gain. You want to see how much you really want to compress, because that's my first step. I run vocals through the distressor before I do any other processing. Some people even track with the one, which is a great idea. Mm-hmm. But personally, if the vocalist doesn't have an issue, which they generally don't, I like to be able to have that option later, because you can't take it away once it's there.
Sure.
You don't want to screw that up. If you track a whole album's worth of vocals with too much compression on the distressor, you listen back and there's silence for a half a second, and then the noise floor jumps 80 decibels, you know you're in trouble.
Yeah.
It can happen, you know, and you just have to be careful. So having that distressor is great. You know, run it through your ADDA and you're in good shape.
Now, what kind of ratios are you using on the way in?
Generally 8-to-1, I think, is the best. It really depends on how wide the range of the vocalist is, how much dynamics is going on. Usually 6-to-1, 8-to-1. For someone who's really dynamic, 8-to-1.
And is there any reason you would dial down further, like 4-to-1?
Like I said, it all depends on dynamics. Sometimes you don't want too much gain reduction. It really depends. It's so hard. It's so hard to go into. You know, it's you see with the vocal track, you should never just go to a preset. You have to listen to the vocal, find out what works best, experiment. Mm-hmm. That's the mark of knowing what you're doing, to know when to take a step back and listen.
I find that's kind of in short supply. Sometimes people kind of see the end of the finish line and just keep processing or just adding something in until it seems to sit, and they never stop at any point and go, does this sound right?
Oh, yeah. You have to know when not to do things. Sometimes things are great. You can't, don't go overboard. See what it needs. That's why the whole thing about not processing soloed makes a huge difference. Listen to it in the mix. When it's sitting right, when it sounds good, it has the presence, it has the vibe, you're in good shape. Don't go nuts. Only if you're trying to get something out of it that isn't there. And sometimes that's impossible.
Speaking of the levels of processing and the compression and everything, we have a couple examples, so maybe you can elaborate a little bit more as we go through. So why don't we start going through some of those, and you can talk about what you did. Greg has a couple of examples from a song he's engineered for me. He's handling all the new stuff from my project Voice of Dissent, as I said earlier. And so we're going to start with raw tracks and build them up and see how he treated them. And you can see what it sounds like at the beginning and how it ends up after he's given it the magic Tomao touch here. So,
oh boy.
Why don't we start in with a piece of just kind of gritty vocals. It's not extreme on either end, but it's an aggressive piece. And we'll go ahead and play the original track with no processing here for a second. And then you can talk about what you decided to do with it, and then we'll play your processed version, okay?
Okay, sounds great.
We are the nameless and were made to kneel before the shapeless. Why blame and steal?
Okay, so that was your raw track. What did you treat it with and why?
Okay, well, I was speaking about the distressor before, and all the raw tracks, the only catch here is that the raw tracks were run through the distressor. I printed those when we were doing the mix. So no issue there. It was doing a little bit, but that little bit is special. And you're also going to hear when the process tracks come in. A lot was done aside from that. So first thing I did is I ran through the distressor with a 6-to-1 ratio, tack on 5, release on 4, input gain to produce about 10 decibels of gain reduction, output to taste below clipping, and the band emphasis on the low pass detector, and distortion 2 to add that harmonic distortion on the audio. So after that, I ran it into a de-esser with about 3 decibels average reduction and the auto threshold, because they were a little bit sibilant vocals, the gritty, which are fine. When you're getting up close and personal with the microphone, it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And it can be fixed. It's not an issue. Oh. Then we did some equalization. We have a high pass at 120, a cut at 180 hertz, cut at 460, high shelf at around 2.3K, and the little presence boost at 6K. From there, we went on to a tiny bit of compression with another 1176, which we did, 76 sim rather, which was with an 8-to-1 ratio, attack of 3, and a release of 5, which is it's a quick compressor in general. It was just bringing some stuff up that we liked, and a tiny bit of stereo widening, which is a pitch shift, time delay with a decent spread, and moderate pre-delayed reverb with a moderate room size, a high pass at 1K, and mixed to taste.
Well, and now with the stereo widener, you said you varied the pitch on it a little bit. How did you set those settings?
Okay, for the stereo widener, I used an 8-cent boost on the right and a 21-cent decrease on the left. That the fact that it's being pushed in those pitch changes add a little bit of wideness to it. Obviously stereo widener, that's what we're trying to do. And also we did a little bit of a time delay, 7 milliseconds to one side and 21 to the other.
Is there any particular reason you picked those numbers, or you just kind of adjusted those time delays by ear?
Adjust to taste. That's the magic of it. Don't use the same settings all the time. It's not going to help you.
Okay. Well, then let's check out what that sounds like with that processing added.
We are the nameless and were made to kneel before the shameless. Why flame and steel? We are the nameless and were made to kneel before the shameless. Why flame and steel?
So now that you've got it set like that, what's your approach to getting it to set right in the mix with all that? I know you said don't listen soloed, so are you adding these pieces in with the instruments as you're doing it, and how are you, adjusting it so that you can actually hear all the processing that's going on without the guitars covering it up and things like that?
See, that's a great question. What I do is some people take different approaches to vocal mixing. Some people leave the vocal in the entire mix. But that's not how I do things. I feel like if the rest of your mix is good, your vocal is going to sit right. So what we do is after I have the instrumental mix the way that the artist likes it and the way that I think it's really doing the job, that's when I start seating my vocal. And I bring it in raw. We listen to the way it's sitting, what it needs and what it doesn't need. That's how we start our EQ. De-esser, I do soloed because I want to hear exactly what's going on with the sibilant frequencies, and I want to see if we can attack them before they start getting compressed and EQ'd. But then with the EQ, everything like that, it's got to happen in the mix. You should be taking your EQ slider on your high pass and moving it while you're listening to the vocal in the mix at a decent level, so you know when you're getting rid of content that's important, because that's when you have to stop. You don't want to lose the body of the vocal. If you high pass it out, that's terrible.
Got it.
That's no blind processing. You got to listen.
We'll go to the next example in a minute. A quick side note while we're talking about how these vocals were set. Now, some of these were doubled, meaning not doubled as in, using processing to do it, but they were both, it was 2 lines sang over again, or rather the same line sang twice. What are your thoughts on double tracking like that, when it's done, when it's not done, and how you handle it?
Okay, double tracking can be really, really awesome, but it also can be miserable. If you have a great vocalist, it's really easy to do it because, first off, your timing's got to be right, your flow's got to be right, and you have to not have, too much sibilant or make too many plosives, because if you do that, it's just going to be a mess in the mix. Because that's where your transients are for the most part in your vocal tracks. And if those are spread out, either you're going to have to use some really tremendous vocal line to get those things lined up, and then you're going to have to attack those. Doubling is kind of like having chords of guitar, but in vocals. Because, you have notes, but now you have notes to comprise a single performance. That's kind of like the vocal doubling thing going on. You could vary it a tiny bit, or you can stay at exactly the same, and it just makes this awesome presence to the vocal. But again, you have to be careful when you're doing it. You have to be careful who's doing it. So do I encourage it? Yes, but make sure that it's a good idea. Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
Is there any time you use it, like some parts that in a song you would use it more, and some parts you would stray away from it?
Oh, absolutely. If you want to really get a line to stand out, double it. And it's actually cool to use doubles for an entire song and automate them up and down depending on how you want to do the lines. That's something that I've done before. I did it on this track, and it was great. Some of those verse lines that you want to be memorable, hit it with the double. Chorus, especially the louder parts in it, double it.
Now, as far as processing, do you handle doubled tracks any differently than a single track?
Definitely. For a double, I will almost always stereo widen it. I will also take out more low end from it, and I won't do such a drastic presence boost. Also, with reverb, you're going to want to have the pre-delay a little bit longer, and you're going to want to have it a little bit less wet, in my opinion. Because, I like to have the main vocal wet because that's what's carrying most of the high end. You don't want to have, in my opinion, for the most part, reverb is about high end. So you don't want to have too much reverb on your double. Sometimes you may not want to use any at all. Obviously to taste. You got to check out the mix.
A side note, vocally, outside of processing, just thinking about it from a vocal production thing, I find that most of the time if you're doing doubling, versus the general rule is you sing the line the same way. You want two nearly identical performances with only slight variations to add color. Then when you get to choruses or emphasized parts, that's where you might sing the double somewhat differently so you can distinctly hear the multiple voices rather than it being one stacked one that lends to a singular tone.
Yeah, that's a great point that you point out there. You can do vocals in so many cool ways in choruses too. Like, you could do different kinds of growls. You could do a scream and a growl, and you could blend them just a tiny bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it could sound really awesome, especially when it's layered underneath. You just get this extra fullness and this extra richness to that particular line that you're doubling.